A little word of warning on this tutorial. There's quite a lot to cover, okay? And I'm going to try and take you through the process of talking about adaptations and adaptive responses to aerobic training. So think about continuous, fartlek, possibly HIIT. We're going to talk about strength training. So think about resistance, think about plyometrics. We're going to talk about flexibility training. Examples obviously would be stretching, PNF, and so on. So we're going to talk about all these three. And when we talk about adaptive responses, the key phrase, I've got the cat next to me making a racket, but the key phrase is that we're talking here about adaptations to training. So if we follow the principles of training, we should cause the body to change, to strengthen, to improve. Those are called physiological adaptations. And one of the things I just want you to be aware of before we jump into the details of this is that some people are more kind of predetermined to have this process happen more efficiently. And we call people either responders, or non-responders. So there are conditions where, despite doing the training in all the right ways, non-responders may have far less of a response to the adaptation process than, for example, responders. Now, the other thing I want to mention to you, for a bunch of years now, you'll have been learning about ribosomes and protein synthesis and cellular process. This is going to give a home to some of that understanding, but it is quite wordy, and therefore we're going to jump into it straight away. So remember, when we are talking about adaptations, we are talking about training for months and years, okay? Months and years of training, not just a couple of training sessions. What happens when we train regularly over a long period of time? Well, the first bunch of adaptations I want to talk about, I'll put it into a nice red for obvious reasons, is I want to talk to you about adaptations of the cardiovascular system, CV system. Now, believe it or not, that was meant to be a heart. Remember, the cardiovascular system is the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. What might change long term about these, and how does it happen? Well, first of all, we will get myocardial hypertrophy, and this is when we are undertaking aerobic training. Myocardial means heart muscle, hypertrophy means thickening and strengthening, the engorging of. Therefore, the heart becomes stronger. What's the knock-on impact of that? We get an up arrow, an increase in stroke volume. Because the muscle wall of the left ventricle strengthens and thickens, the amount of blood it can pump per contraction goes up. Now, as a result, of course, stroke volume has an inverse relationship with heart rate. So as a result of this, we get a decrease in resting heart rate. In other words, a person might go into bradycardic conditions. Your resting heart rate right now might be about 70 to 80 beats per minute. If you train regularly, it might go down to 50 to 60 beats per minute, sometimes lower in more extreme cases. Now, this is really interesting because it gives us an up arrow, an increase in exercise heart rate range. Think about it. If your max heart rate sitting where you are now is 200 beats per minute and your resting heart rate is 80, you've got exercise range of 120 beats. But if your resting heart rate drops to 50 beats per minute, you've got an exercising heart rate of 150 beats. Now, that is what we're talking about with that point there. We also get an increase in maximum, and I'm going to use the figure Q dot. Q dot, I'll put it up here. Q dot equals cardiac output. That's what we mean by that, okay? The dot, by the way, is per unit of time, in this case, a minute. So cardiac output, so increased maximum cardiac output, we can eject more blood per minute, obviously during maximum exercise, than we could previously. In the blood, we also get increased plasma levels. So the plasma, which actually carries a number of products through the blood, not least the red blood cells, we get more of it. We also get a higher, spelling's important, hematocrit. By the way, I'm always hematocrit, by the way, is the proportion of red blood cells in the blood. And of course, if that goes up, we've got more oxygen carriage. Okay, and that's really helpful. Let me put that in. We've got more O2 carriage. Now, I just want to mention something. If you're in North America, we obviously in British English, we have some slight spelling variation. To my knowledge, I'm spelling in British English, and I just want to mention that for those cases, like hemoglobin is a good example, where we have differences, so just be aware of that. Because we've got a more efficient system, we get up arrow, better waste removal. So be thinking about CO2, be thinking about lactic acid, hydrogen ions. We get more waste removal. We also get more nutrient carriage. Okay, so think about your amino acids, your glycerol, think about your fatty acids, think about your glucose. We get more nutrient carriage through the blood. That's one of the reasons we need more plasma, by the way. We also get an increase in strength of smooth muscle. Now, I'll just sort of leave that point hanging. But obviously what we mean by smooth muscle is the muscle around blood vessels like arterioles or even veins that are squeezing blood back to the heart for venous return. Those smooth muscles become more efficient and stronger. And also, finally, we get what's called capillarization. And this is the growth of a broader and richer capillary network. And of course, where's this going to happen for an aerobic performer, maybe a marathon runner, triathlete? This is going to happen at the alveoli for better diffusion rate, and it's also going to happen at the muscle tissue. Now, can I stress again, those are, broadly speaking, what we would call aerobic responses. Now, there are exceptions to that. Strength athletes working in interval training will have to recover rapidly from their anaerobic work, of course, but this is what we're finding there. Now, what we're going to do next is I'm going to move you down here and we're going to think about respiratory adaptations. Again, can I stress, I am mostly focusing here on aerobic type training. What are we going to get? Well, probably the most important change is we get an increase in the strength of, and I'll just put here, resp muscles. So think diaphragm, think external and internal intercostals, think sternocleidomastoid, scalenes, rectus abdominis, pectoralis minor. All of these are involved in breathing. Those muscles become stronger, more efficient, and as a result of that, we can do things such as have a greater tidal volume, amount of air we breathe in and out per breath. It means that our total lung capacity goes up. Now, to be clear, the lungs generally don't get bigger once we're an adult, but what we can do is we muscularly can reach the deeper lung better with that increased strength. Because we've got high tidal volume, we get a decrease in F. F means frequency or breathing rate, just frequency. And the other thing is, if we've got a higher tidal volume, just like when we had a higher stroke volume, we can have an increased breathing rate, F, frequency, an increased frequency, exercise range. So we actually at rest will do fewer breaths per minute, but of course that gives us a bigger range for our exercise conditions. We also get an increased rate of diffusion. This of course is both respiratory and cardiovascular. We get an increased rate of diffusion at the alveoli, okay? Alveoli. And of course we could say the same about the muscle, but we're talking about the lung here. And finally, we get better waste removal. That reminds me of The Sopranos. What a show. Okay, so again, this here is aerobic in consideration. So this is our fartlek trainings, our continuous trainings, maybe our high intensity interval trainings. That's what we're talking about. Let's take things further. We've got our cardiovascular, we've got our respiratory. Let's take this now into what we're going to refer to as metabolic. Okay, so metabolic chemical reactions. And again, this is going to be aerobic in nature. What does aerobic training do to the metabolic processes in the body, including in the muscle cell? Well, first of all, we get more enzyme activity. Okay, so enzymes, there's more of them first of all, and they are more able to, for example, perform aerobic and anaerobic respiration, but we'll concentrate on aerobic. We also get an increased buffering system. Now, we haven't looked at buffering system probably in a lot of detail, but buffering system, very basically speaking, is when we produce lactic acid. Lactic acid breaks down into lactate and hydrogen ions, and it's these things that are fatiguing. What the buffering system does is it releases something called the bicarbonate ion, and it goes and does what we call mopping up of these hydrogen ions. Effectively, it converts them to something called carbonic acid, which then breaks down into CO2 and water, which we can then breathe out. Okay, so it takes the fatiguing part of lactic acid and helps us to breathe it out in the presence of something called the bicarbonate ion and alkali. So I'm not going to get into the teaching of that now. I've actually got tutorials on the website for that if you're interested, but that's what we're talking about. That system becomes better. We also get a decrease in fat mass. Okay, so that's really good for body composition. We also get a delayed obla. So we've looked at obla potentially, if you've watched that tutorial. Obla is the onset of blood lactate accumulation at 4 millimolecules per litre, and of course we've got that lactate inflection point. We can delay that to higher intensity of exercise through good training. We also get decreased insulin resistance. Remember, insulin is really important to exercise because insulin is a hormone that can encourage and it can cause more glucose to enter the cell. So if the resistance to that goes down, that's going to happen more. And finally, we get increased fat oxidation. Of course, fat's a brilliant fuel source if we can process it rapidly, because it's got the most energy per unit. So fat oxidation, or beta oxidation, sometimes we call it, that goes up as a process. Fantastic. Now then, all of those were aerobic responses. Everything I've put there is aerobic responses. What we're going to do now is sort of switch our attention a little bit. We're going to start to think about, what colour was that? Not the one I wanted. We're now going to start to think about muscular responses. And this is where we're going to start moving into more strength-based training. So if we undertake things like resistance training, for example, we're going to get an increase in fast glycolytic fibers. The units of muscle within the muscle tissue are going to be more geared towards explosiveness. We are going to get an increase in cross-sectional area of muscle. Basically, the muscles are going to get bigger. Now, assuming for a second that muscle tissue is lean and not fat-rich, what that's going to cause is that we're going to get sort of more force output. In fact, let me put that in here. We're going to get more force as a result. We'll get more force from muscle contractions. We also get an increase in tendon strength. The tendons, which of course transmit force from the muscular tissue onto the skeletal tissue, those become stronger and can resist more force. We also get an increased speed of contraction. So not only force, but speed of contraction goes up. We also get, even though this is not ultimately muscular, we also get stronger ligaments. The ligaments become better able at managing and stabilizing dynamic movements such as games. And this is a really nice point that I want to make here. We also get increased strength of contraction through a greater ROM. Now, through up arrow ROM. I haven't really given myself much space there. And that last point is the important one. We're getting, it's not just that we're applying more strength to, let's say, our sprinting or our lifts or whatever it is. We're doing it through a greater range of motion. So we're able to apply force in our performances through a greater range. And that really makes a big difference. Now, we're getting there, folks. Let's move over to neural adaptations. Just a few to go. And thank you for hanging in with me. Again, neural adaptations really refer to strength, about the nervous system. What do we get? We get increased coordination. We get increased coordination of antagonistic pairs. So pairs of muscles that operate at a joint, they become more coordinated. In other words, we can be more skillful, more accurate. We also get an increase in the speed of nerve transmission. So the actual signals to contract, they actually increase speed, get there faster, and that can increase things like reaction time. It would actually decrease reaction, or improve reaction time, etc. Now, last couple of points, guys. Just up here now, we are now thinking about metabolic, and again, you're going to say, well, we've done this already, James, metabolic, but specifically to strength training. If we do strength training like resistance training, plyometrics, what metabolic changes happen? Well, we might store more glycogen in the muscle, as well as the liver, but let's put it in the muscle. We might have more ATP in the muscle. We might have, guess what, more PC in the muscle. No surprise there. These are the anaerobic reactants, right? We need them for that reason. And as a result of that, if I was to tell you that we get more glycolytic output and longer phosphagen system endurance, so we might go from 10 seconds of phosphagen ATP resynthesis to 12 or 14 seconds. That would hopefully make sense, but that is very much from strength. And then my final points for today, guys, and thank you for hanging in there with me, we want to look at adaptations to flexibility. So if we do flexibility training, think PNF, stretching, etc., what's going to happen? Well, we get the following. We get an increased length of resting muscle. The muscle tip fibers themselves, they are longer, and muscle fibers increase length at rest, so they are effectively longer. We also get adapted muscle spindles. The muscle spindles, which are the sensory organs within the muscle, they also lengthen, as we've mentioned here. And what that causes is what we call a delay in the stretch reflex. In other words, the tendency for the muscle to contract to prevent overstretching is delayed to a greater ROM. And as a result of all of that, we get an increased elasticity of muscle. So, folks, a ridiculously long tutorial, about 1,000,003 words, but hopefully that's given you a good understanding and a range of material to consider to be the adaptive response of the body to training, and how exciting it is to cause some or all of this to happen in one's own physiology.